Hi everyone, my name's Jo and I work for the Fair Trade Foundation, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how the power you have to create change with the things you buy is really strong and important. So I've got a few slides that I'm going to share with you. Let me just do this. So everything you buy, every t-shirt, every pen, every bar of chocolate has a backstory. And often this story stretches back months or even years before that product came to you. So it's had this whole previous life that you might not know much about, involving distant places and many, many people and lots of processes. And often your product, whether it's your pen, your t-shirt, your chocolate, has traveled really, really far. From the moment that the raw materials for it were first mined or farmed, or however that they were extracted, until the moment that it came to you. And not just that, but along the way, your product has had a profound effect on everyone who's had a role in getting it to you and all the places that it's been through. And this is what I want us to think about a bit today, how the things we buy travel through many places, many hands, and they leave their mark on those places, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So this story started months before a product came to me, and I'm going to talk in particular today, I'm going to talk about one of my favourite chocolates here. I've got this bar, Tony's Chocolonely, very delicious, their trademark on the back. So I'm going to focus on chocolate. Lots of other fair trade chocolate is available, but this one's one of my faves. So I'm going to focus on my chocolate, but this really applies to anything. And as I said, this story started long before we bought this from our local store. It goes back months. In fact, depending on how much we want to get into these issues, it goes back years, a really long time. And in actual fact, my part in this story is really quite small. So I've got this chocolate, and as soon as this workshop's over, I'm probably going to scoff it. So the story ends as far as I'm concerned today. But actually, there can also be part of the story after you've had what your thing in your hand. And for this, because it's food, it's edible, the bit that's left over after is the wrapping. But with some of the products you buy, there's a really big after story as well. And the choices you make can have a really big effect on how those before and after bits go. So I was talking about my chocolate, my Tony's, and the story. And the story started quite a long time ago. So in particular, this is the part that we probably know the most about. And this is all what's happened in the last year. But even that, you might think, given that this chocolate was bought this morning and will be all gone by tonight, the fact that even if it goes back a year is probably a little bit interesting to you. So let's suppose that this cocoa was harvested during last year's big harvest in West Africa, which is in around October. Now, the first bit of the process happens really quite fast, and within the first few days, the pods are split, the beans are removed, they spend about 6 days drying and fermenting in the sun. So that would all have been last year. Then it would be collected, taken to the port, and transported to somewhere in Europe where it would be manufactured. This process can take some time. Cocoa's good to sit in bags for months, maybe even up to a year. Processed, once it's been made into a bar, again, it's got quite a long shelf life. It will sit in storage in a warehouse and eventually make it onto the shop floor and into my house and my hands. But actually, the story goes back even further. And I think this is a really interesting thing, because if we're talking about the issues around this, for example, let's talk about cocoa trees. From the stage that the cocoa pods and the beans that we saw coming off the tree there, until this point, there has been an awful lot of people working on it and going through lots of places, as I said. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that all along the line, the work that happened there had an impact on the planet. None of this happens in isolation. So in particular, we might think about the transportation, the manufacture, all the carbon in that, but also the things that went before it and how they created a successful harvest had a massive impact on the planet. But I want to think about the cocoa farm at this stage. So this is a cocoa farm in West Africa. And actually, if we go back beyond that harvest point, you know, we could go back years to think about the issues around white chocolate. So this is because cocoa trees themselves don't even produce pods until they're 5 or 6 years old. So planting cocoa is a real long-term commitment. There's no quick money here. And the trees are productive for about 30 or 40 years after they start producing pods, maybe more. But the amount of pods they produce will dramatically decline over time. They'll become less productive, like most things. And eventually, those trees will no longer be any use. The cocoa farmers often have inherited the land. The trees are often quite old. They might have been planted by their parents, something like that. And part of the costs that they have to incur in keeping their farms going is about replacing their trees from now and then, and they have various stages of trees at various stages of their lives and various stages of productivity. They'll have younger trees and older trees on their farms, and that's an ongoing thing. Cocoa farming is really hard physical work. It's really, really hot and humid in the places where it grows. Usually sort of 30+ degrees, lots of rain. That's what makes cocoa grow. It only grows in equatorial areas such as West Africa and in parts of South America. But it's really hard work, and actually the farmers get a really small amount of money from it. This is Lucia, and Lucia is a cocoa farmer in Sierra Leone, and her family work the farm. She has a husband, she has some sons, and it's been in their family for a few generations. Everybody works the farm, they sell their cocoa, and they rely on that for their living. And this is the biggest problem, because the price they receive is low, and each year they have costs for growing their crops, such as equipment and transport, and these costs go up every year. So farmers like Lucia, who have relatively small farms that they own, they're entirely dependent on for their income. They're caught between the value of their cocoa being low and their costs being really high and getting higher, and the amount of money they get is being squeezed. And you might be wondering, well, why don't they just charge more for their cocoa? But this is where power plays its hand, and power is a really, really important part of this story, and not just for chocolate, but for so many of the things that we enjoy, whether it's food, clothes, electronics, all kinds of things. It's really not a coincidence that a lot of these things are either grown, mined, made, manufactured in the global south, and in places where people often are living in poverty, where they work hard for a small amount of money, and they have relatively little power in terms of negotiating a better deal for themselves. So a lot of the cocoa that goes into the chocolate we enjoy in the UK comes from West Africa, some of it comes from South America, and it's grown by these smallholder farmers who maybe have the equivalent of a football field's worth of farm. It's pretty small. They farm it with their families. It's often their only source of income, and often they work in really, really remote places. So I was really lucky last year that I visited some farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, and some of these farmers, it's not just that they are without electricity, they're without their own transport, they're without access to healthcare. Some of them aren't even on a road. So I visited some farmers where the last hour of the journey was walking or motorbike, because they're that far from a road, and even that road that they were on would barely pass as a road. So very, very remote. A lot of them didn't go to school, or certainly not for long. They can't read or write, and they have very few options with what they can do with their lives. And they sell to traders or big companies who are slick, sophisticated, have lots of power, and they rely on these relationships. You know, they don't really have much of a chance to negotiate better prices with these big global slick outfits of, you know, of traders and whatnot, and they're often not making enough money for a decent standard of living. The impact of this is that they can't afford medical care, medicine, school fees, and sometimes even nutritious food. When I asked the headmaster of one of the local schools in Côte d'Ivoire, where I visited, what the biggest problem was that he faced with the children in his school, he really surprised me when he said hunger, and particularly when you get in the last few weeks and months before the harvest, because the farmers tend to get their money in a big, you know, one big lot or one big lot and one smaller lot when they have the smaller harvest, and they struggle to make it last throughout the year. So he said the one thing he could do to transform the you know, the opportunity for children in school was to get them lunch, and that was one of the things that they were doing. So sometimes farmers really feel like they have no other choice but to farm in a way that they hope will increase their crops, and therefore increase their income. And sometimes what they do is turn to chemicals to increase what they grow, or they might cut down trees to try more, you know, get more space, sell the timber, lots of things like that. And obviously this has a really big impact, not just on their immediate environment, which it can be really challenging, affecting things like the temperatures on the ground and how water moves down, making them susceptible to things like flooding when it happens, but also on a more global scale. We all know that forests are the lungs. It's about the global, that we all rely on forests further away, not just in our immediate area. And this is a really big problem where Lucia lives in Sierra Leone. So in Sierra Leone, it's a really interesting country, but they've suffered a lot in recent years with things like civil war and the Ebola virus, which has had a massive effect on the economy. And for farmers, they don't get a lot of support from the state. And it's really hard for them to make their voices heard. So, you know, it's not just people that suffer, though, from this situation, this poverty, because they will then find ways to try and earn more money. And this is where you get this whole interaction between the people and the environment. And Lucia lives on the edge of a beautiful, large, enormous forest called the Gola rainforest, which is of huge international importance. You know, loads and loads of species there. It's really, really important as a place for, you know, doing that air quality function. And there aren't all that many of these areas in the world left being untouched. And when the people around that live and rely on making a living from the land in that area are living a really tenuous existence and don't have decent livelihoods, they will turn to doing whatever they can. And this shows here, this picture, where the forest has been removed in order to grow other crops. And people will often do this. So around the edge of the Gola rainforest, people will turn to cutting down trees to sell for timber, turning up the forest to put things like rice in, to grow rice, because it's a lot easier. You grow rice, you know, get a couple of harvests a year rather than this cocoa, which you have to wait 5 years from planting a new plant before you even get anything. But things like that, like taking up forest and planting rice and other crops, are really damaging to, you know, for biodiversity, for the wildlife, for the forest cover. And that has such huge knock-on effects in terms of air quality, in terms of keeping the temperature low, and what happens with things like the soil getting eroded. So it's a really big deal. And Gola is a really big area of forest and really beautiful, and a lot of it is quite wild, but poverty can drive people to seeking alternate ways of making a living. And if we want to preserve forests such as Gola, I feel that we in the global north and everywhere in the world have to take joint responsibility with those farmers to come up with solutions, and to take global responsibility to ensure that the people who are there, who are the guardians of these environments that we also rely on, are able to survive and have at least their basic needs met, but a dignified living. So remember that I was saying to you that actually my part in my chocolate story is only one day, but it's the most important part of the story. And that's because actually I'm the consumer. I'm the ultimate person, the end user, who bought this chocolate and is going to eat it, maybe share it with my family if I'm feeling generous. And what I want as a consumer affects what happens all the way back along that supply chain. And it really affects the kind of life the people that grow the cocoa, such as Lucia and her family, manage to make for themselves as they're dependent on the income from this cocoa. And again, this isn't just about cocoa producers. This is also about people who produce clothing, who produce electronics, who produce all kinds of foodstuffs in all kinds of places. And often I think we've become quite removed from where these things come from, who grew them, and what that cost is for those people and for their environment. But actually what the consumer wants is really, really powerful in this. And the manufacturers and the retailers who are responsible for bringing us these products, they have to have customers in order to keep their business going. And actually what we want will affect what they do all the way back down the supply chain, ending up here. This is Lucia and her family. But it's difficult because most of us have never had the chance to visit a cocoa farm or an electronics factory or a clothing manufacturer factory or anything like that. And we all buy hundreds of items every year. I mean, even if you just think about your food, we probably buy, an average household would buy 100 odd items a week in their grocery shopping, plus everything else. So we buy so many things every year, and a lot of us have been quite mindful about cutting down on our consumption and not buying things we don't need, but we certainly still have to buy things. I'm not going to get my coffee or my chocolate or my bananas unless I buy them. They're not something I can grow for myself, and they're things that we've come to be very accustomed to as a regular part of our diet week in, week out. So certain levels of consumption aren't going to change, but we need to think very strongly about where they come from and who's paying for the price, and is the price that we are paying really reflective of being able to offer those producers a sustainable and dignified way of life. Now, sadly, along many supply chains, that's not what they're getting. And again, I'll come back to this idea about power. The consumers have a lot of the power to make what they want known. And the companies who sell us the products have a lot of power. And it's really complex because often the people who produce those raw materials have very little power. Just like I was explaining about the cocoa farmers, they've got limited choices. They can't just flex and do something else. They've invested a lot into these trees. There's not the infrastructure for them to sell other products. So they kind of have to carry on and do whatever they can to make it work for them. So how can we make informed decisions, and how can we start to redress those power relations? And this is, it's a really difficult thing for us to try and figure out, because like I said, we buy so many things in a week, in a year, and they come from a lot of different places and involve a lot of different people. So trying to get into the ethics and the sustainability of all of those products would be an impossible task. So obviously one of the things that I'm going to talk to you about briefly then is one of the ways you can tell. This is the fair trade mark. It is on my favourite chocolate. It is also on my favourite coffee, my bananas, sugar, nuts, all kinds of things. And precisely why the fair trade mark exists is to try and help us with finding out about the impact on those people and on the environment of the products that we enjoy. So you know that something with a fair trade mark has met certain standards. And the thing that's really, I think, really important here is that the fair trade mark is independent. So it isn't a company declaring their own product to have met certain standards. It's a separate entity saying, yes, they've met certain standards. And what those standards are, they mean that the farmer has to have a minimum price and a premium on top. And this little graph here shows you, this is a sort of a stylized one. So it's not an actual product, it's just to show you what it means. So where the world market price for products, so let's say cocoa, since that's what we've been talking about, would be the red line. And it goes up and down and up and down. It's all supply and demand. So if lots of people are buying cocoa, that will affect the price. If there's a big glut one year of lots and lots of cocoa, that will push it down. People are competing to sell. So the red line is the world market price. The blue line shows what the fair trade minimum price is. So this is a safeguard that ensures the price never drops any lower than that. And that is minimum cost in order to make sure those farmers can just make a basic living. But the price will go up with the world market price, but never drop any lower. So that's what it means. But what's really important here, and especially because I was saying to you about these costs, the costs just don't affect the people, they affect the environment. If a farmer's got nowhere to go, if they can't pass on price reductions any lower, then sometimes what they do is to start farming in a way that can be damaging. And it's just what they need to do to try and put food on the table. So those costs are often borne either by the producers or by their environments. And as we know, ultimately, even if those costs are borne by a producer environment, that affects us all. So in order to make sure that those producers can live in a way that is both sustainable and gives them the livelihood they need to provide for their families, this is what the minimum price does. So the fair trade price will go up so they don't lose out if it's going up on the market price, but it just won't dip any lower. Now, it is still tough for farmers to make a living within that. And they often are living in places where they've got very little in the way of infrastructure. And the premium goes on top to help them to develop that. So they use that big lump of extra money to invest in things that help them, like education, water supply, electricity, all kinds of projects like that. So this is one way that you can find out, but also being a discerning producer, a discerning consumer means asking questions and finding out. And one of the most important things that you can do is actually hold to account the companies that produce the products you like. So some of you may have seen that earlier this year, Kit Kat announced their decision to stop sourcing or stop paying a fair trade price for the cocoa that they put into their Kit Kat bars. And what was really interesting then was actually how over 300,000 people sent a strong message to Nestle saying, this isn't what we want. They wanted that to be continued with a fair trade price for those farmers. So the cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire and some sugar farmers who were predominantly in Fiji, they wanted them to continue getting a fair trade price and premium. And this is really important because these companies will respond in some way to what they're hearing from their consumers. Now, this didn't change their ultimate decision, but it did make them make concessions about information. The farmers didn't want this. The farmers said they wanted to stay with it. So this is one of the things you can also do. This is just an example. It's one of the things you can do is to tell those companies or ask the questions of them as to how they ensure that the people they buy their products from at the start of the supply chain, how they are able to make a living, look after their environment, and how working within that supply chain makes their life, makes their livelihood, so that they can live with dignity. And this is an example. Telling them is so powerful. Telling them what you want, because ultimately they will respond to consumers. Maybe not always in the exact way you want, but to some degree. So one of the other things that's really important, and particularly at the moment, one of the things that's within your power is to also, it's not just about the producers, the companies and the consumers, because a lot of what happens with the products we like is all within a big framework, within a global framework of trade deals and all of that sort of thing. And at the moment, a lot of those are being renegotiated. So another thing that we can all do is to get involved with that. We can talk to our MPs, we can talk to politicians about the trade deals we want to see, and that's something that we've done at Fair Trade a fair bit in the past. And as these new trade deals are coming up with Brexit, we can ask them to make sure that farmers aren't going to lose out in the global south. So we have a lot more power in affecting those lives of the people that produce the things we like than you might first think. Firstly, we're looking at what we buy. Nothing quite is as powerful as the pounds in your pocket for voting for the world you want to see, supporting those companies that produce the products where they align with your values, where they're produced in a way that you want to see, that they protect the people and the environment where the products are sourced. Secondly, asking those tricky questions of the companies that produce the things you want to consume. Maybe they aren't, maybe you don't know, maybe they're not doing what you want them to do. Challenging them, that is how change is created. And finally, trying to make sure that those structures are in place that make it work well for farmers. But one of the most important things that you can do as well is to share the message, is to tell other people about this, because some people still don't know how difficult life is for those that produce our products, and they don't really know about their own sense of making a change to the lives of other people around the world. So we all have a lot more power than we maybe think, and the way we choose to spend our money and spend our influence is really, really important. Thank you. So I'm wondering if there's any questions that anyone wants to pop onto the chat. We've got a little bit of time left. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make about that? So what's the best thing that schools can do, and what action would we like young people to take? I think the best thing that schools can do is to actually raise awareness about the products that we buy and how important it is to be mindful and to find out about those lives and livelihoods of producers. So the one action I'd like you to take is to think about what you're buying before you buy it. Have a look and ask those questions. So you know that the fair trade mark is one of the things that can show you, it's a shorthand to show that the farmers have been paid the fair trade minimum price and the premium, but also there are other things out there to go away and research and find out and ask those questions and talk to your supermarkets. Is there a change the government needs to make too? Well, at the moment, all of our trade deals are up for negotiation. People in those places, for example, the people that we work with, are going to be very much impacted by those changes, because they've been selling into the UK market. They are very worried that they might lose that access to the UK market, maybe just temporarily, but maybe permanently, and that there'll be more costs associated with selling their products in the UK. So we can, when that comes around, we can keep telling our politicians that we want to see trade deals that don't disadvantage people in the global south. We want to make sure that they're not suddenly hit with a load more extra costs to sell into the UK, because invariably that will be passed on to them and not to the consumer. So that's quite an important point at this time, as those deals are being renegotiated. What's the thing that gets you most excited about working for fair trade? I think probably when I meet producers, it's incredible to meet people who live in different parts of the world and to hear their concerns and their hopes and their dreams, but also to see how incredibly entrepreneurial a lot of our producers are, finding ways around the situation that they're in, ways to try and create more income, to start growing, to diversify, grow different crops, and really ways to make life better is really amazing. And we work together with them. They tell us the things that are needed. We work with them to support them. But I'm very lucky that, to work with this system that supports incredible people in the global south, and to hear about their challenges is just wonderful. And to share that information with our people in the UK about the producers that we meet is fantastic. And when I visit and I see how difficult life is for people that sell the products that I love, it gets me quite cross. I just think, how is it still that people are living without clean water in this day and age, when it's been available in some parts of the world for ridiculous amounts of time? How is that possible? And then particularly when they're selling into global supply chains, luxury goods in the UK. I just don't think that's good enough anymore. And that's what makes me feel like we need to push on and shout louder and really hold to account these big businesses that sell us the products that we love, and really say to them, look, this isn't okay that people are still living like this. That's a tricky question. If there was one business that you'd like to see turn fair trade, which would it be? I'd like to see, I think probably for me, I'd like to see more chocolate be fair trade. I'd like to see all chocolate be fair trade, obviously, but having visited cocoa farmers, it's such a complex issue, and especially with the farmers in West Africa, they really live in poverty, and it's a really complex issue. And I think at the moment it's really topical, looking at our historical legacies of sort of the legacy of colonialism and slavery. It's no coincidence that a lot of the products that we love have this kind of real correlation with places that were heavily affected by colonialism and slavery. So things like sugar and bananas and cocoa in particular. And those power relations have remained. Those colonial power relations are still there. And so people in West Africa are still living in this kind of, these really hard existences, farming cocoa, to go into huge global corporations located in the north to sell us snacks, luxury things for quite cheap. And they have very little say on it. The odds are stacked against them in terms of them being able to maybe make chocolate and sell it in and overcome working with some of those big companies. And I just don't think it's okay anymore. I think we need to be looking very much at how we relate to marginalized people around the world, whoever they are, and our relationship and our responsibilities to them. So I'd like to see all cocoa go fair trade. Regarding climate change, that's really interesting. So in particular in West Africa, it's making the temperatures a little bit more unpredictable and the rainfall unpredictable. This is actually a story that we hear from our producers around the world in so many different places. So the major factors are unpredictable rainfalls and unpredictable temperatures, and this can go in both directions. So for example, what farmers are finding in West Africa is they're getting longer of the hot weather, very hot weather. I mean, it's always pretty hot there, but longer of the very hot weather. One of the problems this causes is it promotes or encourages the growth of the fungus that they get there called black pod, and that can just ruin a farmer's crop because they all get covered in fungus. That's it, they're gone. We hear a similar story, for example, in Central America with coffee farmers. The temperatures can help, it prevents them from controlling pests and funguses because the weather is so much warmer for much longer, much wetter. Rainfalls become unpredictable, where you used to be able to say the rains always come here, now they don't, and that can be really devastating for the crops. Some of the tea farmers that I met in India, they have some problems at the opposite end as well. They've started to get frost, which was extremely rare, and they're now getting it every year, and that can be really damaging to their tea crops. So much so that they just have to sort of prune them back. They will regenerate, but they'll have months and months of not being able to pluck anything off those bushes after they've been frost bitten, I suppose is the word. So it's really, really tricky for farmers to deal with climate change when they're people with the fewest resources to adapt, and suffering. They're really at the sharp end of this. So thank you very much for listening. Please check out our website and get in contact with me if you have any further questions.